Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for this afternoon's, I think we're calling it, debate panel discussion, which means it's not going to be a super tight format. I'd like to begin by introducing myself and then talking to you about the structure of today's debate panel discussion. I am DJ Grothe, and I'm coming from the Center for Inquiry. As a veteran of a lot of debates like this, I think there's no more important question for college students to ask. The implications of the big God question are big. I think we shouldn't dismiss the question, and in fact, this panel discussion shows just how important we think the debate is to have. The format of today's discussion is going to be where one person from each side is going to give a 5 to 7 minute argument for the position. So, yes, God does exist, there's good evidence for it. No, I either believe there is no God or I lack belief that there is a God, and here's my reason why. On the other side, after each one of those presentations, unlike last panel discussion, there's going to be a moderated discussion among every member of the panel. So there's going to, rather than just seeing a lineup of one argument, another argument, it's going to really, right out the gates, have some room for a back and forth. After all that's said and done, we're going to entertain some questions and good answers from the audience to the panelists. So with that, I'd like to begin by introducing our first interlocutor, and that is Zach Mannis. Dr. Mannis earned his PhD in philosophy from Baylor, and he's currently professor at Southwestern Baptist University. He's currently working on several papers, mostly pertaining to religious ethics, Kierkegaard's writings. He's the co-author of the forthcoming book. It's coming out really soon coming out from InterVarsity Press, Philosophy of Religion, Thinking About Faith. Join me in welcoming Dr. Zach Mannis. And yeah. Thanks.
There's some space. It's not like that. Is this anybody's phone?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the question here is how many rationalists does it take to turn on PowerPoint? Here we go. Okay.
Thanks. Though it might seem surprising at first, debates about God's existence often focus more on the credibility of religious belief than on the truth of the proposition that God exists. To understand why, notice that something can be true even if we have no knowledge of it. Even if there were no evidence whatsoever for God's existence, it still wouldn't follow from this alone that God doesn't exist. But in that case, we would likely judge that religious belief is unreasonable. So what's really at stake in this debate is the nature of religious belief. Specifically, whether religious belief is, or at least could be, rational or justified or warranted. Most atheists hold that religious belief cannot be any of these. A common line among atheists is that religious belief is irrational or unjustified on the grounds that it is not supported by sufficient evidence. Sam Harris, for example, in his book Letter to a Christian Nation, laments that while believing strongly, without evidence, is considered a mark of madness or stupidity in any other area of our lives, faith in God still holds immense prestige in our society. Of course, if it's to be fair, this criticism of religious belief must be a specific application of a more general epistemic principle. It must not turn out that we are applying a standard to religion that we apply to nothing else. We could perhaps state the general principle like this. A belief is justified only if it's supported by sufficient evidence. For ease of reference, let's call this thesis evidentialism. Upon first encounter, this thesis sounds perfectly sensible. After all, what would be the alternative? To think that any belief can be justified, no matter how speculative or baseless, even those a person might just make up? If that's what the denial of evidentialism amounts to, then we should all be evidentialists, and belief in God should be rejected if it doesn't meet the evidentialist standard, as atheists often allege. What I want to argue, however, is that a rejection of evidentialism implies no such thing, and that there are, in fact, compelling reasons to reject evidentialism, at least evidentialism of the form that is supposed to undermine religious belief. To see why, consider first the key term, evidence. Atheists wielding the evidentialist objection to religious belief often leave this term undefined, apparently presuming its meaning to be intuitive and obvious. But there are at least two legitimate, but importantly different ways of understanding evidence, and either one, if employed consistently, will lead to trouble for the evidentialist critic of religion. One way that philosophers use the term evidence is roughly like this. Evidence refers to a type of belief, namely reasons. To give reasons for a certain belief one holds is to cite other beliefs one holds which provide rational support for that belief. Understood this way, however, evidentialism is wildly implausible. For one thing, it will turn out to entail radical skepticism, the view that we know nothing at all about the world around us, a view which I presume none of my atheist interlocutors wishes to endorse. The reason that evidentialism on this version of evidence will turn out to entail skepticism is that it will turn out that justified belief is impossible. In order to be justified on this account, a belief has to be supported by evidence, that is, by other beliefs or reasons. But those supporting beliefs, in order to do what they're supposed to do, they have to themselves be justified, that is, supported by still other beliefs, and so on ad infinitum. On this understanding of evidence, then, the evidentialist objection turns out to imply that no belief is justified because justification requires an infinite regress of supporting beliefs, which of course could not be obtained. So on the assumption that justification is required for knowledge, this will lead to radical skepticism. Second, evidentialism of this variety cannot account for our ordinary knowledge. Consider ordinary perceptual beliefs. For example, my belief that I'm presently in a room with other people. And memory beliefs. For example, my belief that I had cereal for breakfast this morning. Beliefs of these types are immediate, that is, not inferred from other beliefs that one holds. They result from the proper functioning of one's epistemic faculties, such as your faculty of vision and your faculty of memory. Evidentialism implies that no such beliefs are ever justified, but that's absurd. But perhaps this is not what atheists have in mind when they use the term evidence. Perhaps what they have in mind is something more like this. Evidence is, roughly, anything in one's experience that grounds one's belief and makes that belief warranted. On this rendering of evidence, I have evidence that I'm presently in a room with other people, because I see you now, and I have evidence that I had cereal for breakfast, because I remember doing so. Unfortunately for the atheist, however, applying this notion of evidence consistently will have the result that evidentialism no longer rules out religious belief. Christian philosophers are apt to put the point like this. Just as we have reliable faculties of vision and memory and many others that, when functioning properly and under normal circumstances, naturally produce in us beliefs that are perfectly warranted, so also we possess a kind of religious faculty. Borrowing a term from John Calvin, call it the sensus divinitatis, a faculty that, under appropriate conditions, naturally produces in us beliefs which straightforwardly imply that God exists. Looking up at the night sky and contemplating the vastness of the universe, for example, one might naturally form the belief God created all this. Or on the occasion of hearing a powerful sermon, one might find oneself forming beliefs like, God really does care about me, or the way I've been living my life is displeasing to God. To say that these beliefs straightforwardly imply that God exists is just to say that they can be true only if God exists. Because the entailment is obvious, if a person is warranted in believing any of these things, then that person is warranted in believing that God exists. It seems likely that if we were created by the kind of personal God that Christians profess, then we would have some such faculty. It would be surprising, to say the least, if God had created the world such that the only ones capable of warranted religious belief were those few privileged enough by natural intelligence and educational opportunities to understand complex arguments for his existence. But what this suggests... Can I finish this paragraph? Yeah. But what this suggests is that the discussion we are having today about arguments for God's existence, while important and immensely interesting, is one that, regardless of how it turns out, could not possibly suffice to undermine religious belief. Religious belief can be warranted apart from any and all arguments for God's existence. What the atheist needs is some knockdown argument that God does not exist. But no one has ever produced such an argument, and I think it rather doubtful that we're going to see one for the first time today. Thanks.
Thank you. And so because I think the conversation is going to be very important, I'm going to try not to be too draconian about time, but I will flag that, so if we're in the middle of a big crescendo of an argument, we can bring it to a close. Right now, we're going to have some response and then open it up to all the panelists. So right out the gates, 1 or 2 sentence response, and then we'll open it up to everyone. Victor Stenger.
I would like to argue that evidentialism is just what science does, and it's not justified by some philosophical argument. It's justified by the fact that science works. Evidentialism works, and that's why we can trust it, and that's why we can say there's no evidence that God exists, because that's a fact. That's a fact that we could rely on, and it's also a fact, as I'm going to try to explain more, especially in my talk tomorrow, that it's a fact that there's evidence against the existence of God. These are all statements that can be made based on the belief that science is a way of viewing things that we can have confidence in.
Do I have a mic in here?
It's right there.
Oh, okay.
The tables are mine.
Oh, good. Excellent. If evidentialism is just what science does, then I suppose that it's fine for scientists to assume an evidentialist thesis. But the thing is, belief in God is not a scientific proposition. And you're not going to be able to either rule out that proposition or prove it on scientific grounds. But I take it that this is clearly not a scientific proposition. It's an epistemic proposition, and epistemology is the theory of knowledge. It's a basic part of philosophy. It would be very strange to collapse the distinction between those. So I'm not sure what you would mean in saying that this is a scientific proposition. Notice, after all, that this is not the kind of proposition that could enjoy empirical support of any kind. So if you thought, for example, that evidence here referred to empirical support, which is the kind of support that we get from the sciences, it will turn out that this is a thesis that is self-refuting. Because after all, the proposition that a belief is justified only if it's supported by sufficient evidence is not going to then turn out to be supported by sufficient evidence, since there is no empirical support for that proposition.
Thoughts on the A side, reactions to that?
Well, actually, I'll make a thought and then actually pose another question. Make a thought and pose another question. Let's get the microphone over by me. In regards to your discussion of evidentialism, I agree with the second one you're talking about, the grounds of belief. Let's not, I don't want to be straw man by pegging me on a particular definition of evidence, for example.
Okay.
I have a very broad understanding of evidentialism in that sense. Having said that, to play off what Victor was saying is, evidentialism as practiced by science works. And for example, you build a model, you create a model, and then you test that model by seeing if the predictions that model entails are borne out in experience, and if they're not, then you reject that model. And we actually live our whole lives that way. It's not just what science does. And to give you an example, when you brought up the idea that theism entails the sensus divinitatis, I actually agree with you. Theism does logically entail that we would all have a sensus divinitatis. The problem is that model predicts that everyone, from the beginning of recorded history, all shamans, all religions, all cultures, would all have the same image of God, the same understanding of the gospel. We would all agree on what this sensus divinitatis was telling us. And we would have agreed from as far back as ever. So to me, when I hear this thing, I see this prediction. The prediction is not borne out. We see exactly the opposite. We see confusion and disagreement, and even within the Christian religion, they can't even agree on what God's message is, really. So this, to me, refutes the sensus divinitatis. It also then refutes theism by the same connection. So my question is how do you respond to that particular scenario, that particular problem?
Well, I think couple of thoughts. You've taken a particular argument and turned it into a universal argument. A sensus divinitas does not mean that all are going to have the same experience. first of all. Another thing that I think is interesting in what you just said there was science works. We're not going to be in dispute, and you'll see when Greg gets up there, we're not in dispute that science works on all kinds of levels. And in fact, I would say on a vast majority of what we'll call empirical evidence, there's going to be agreement between our two tables. What we will be able to demonstrate is that science does not disprove the existence of God, and thoughtful, scientific-minded folks affirm theism, as well as thoughtful, scientific folks not affirming theism. So I think the idea that a sensus divinitas has to be, by definition, the same in every experience is a little bit of an assumption.
Quick response on this side before the next.
I don't understand that answer really. I mean, why would God give us a sensus divinitatis and then use it to give everyone different messages, different information? I don't see the utility of that or the intelligent design in that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Maybe just one quick response, yes.
Yeah, I think the quick response, first I wouldn't want to say that theism entails that we have a sensus divinitatis, but I think the ubiquity of religious belief strongly suggests that there is such a faculty. But philosophers and theologians who have believed in this would not want to say that this is a faculty that reveals to us, for example, the doctrine of the Trinity or the Incarnation or any other such specific doctrine. The idea is that we have an immediate sense of the divine, so as the term would imply. It's not meant to suggest that out of this faculty alone we have detailed knowledge of the nature or acts of God.
And for now someone from the nay side, either to argue there's lack of evidence for belief in God, or to Stenger now, or to possibly argue there's reason to believe there is no God, please join me in welcoming our next speaker. I'll tell you about him. His research career helped establish the properties of strange particles, quarks, gluons, and neutrinos. He helped pioneer the
Thank you very much. I'm going to try to explain to you why I think not only is there no evidence for God, that there is actually evidence against God. Now, please remember that the God I'm talking about is the God most people worship, a God who plays an important role in the universe, who listens to every thought. In other words, the God that most Jews, Christians, and Muslims worship. I certainly can't rule out the existence of a remote God of some type, like a deist God who just set the universe in motion. So this is a God that I claim should be detectable. The God hypothesis is not about the nature of God. It's about the fact that the God that most people worship should have observable effects. If such a God existed, we would know about it. And I totally refute the idea that science has nothing to say about God. As you'll see from my arguments, that if God existed, science could have detected that God. And there have been experimental tests to see if that God exists. For example, the God that most people worship is a God that answers prayers. There have been several very good, well-controlled experiments by people from reputable universities like Harvard, Duke, the Mayo Clinic, in an attempt to study the efficacy of prayer. These experiments, incidentally, were not done by skeptics. All the people working on these experiments were, in fact, believers. They would like to have found evidence for God, and they could have found evidence for God. And who then, my friends here, would be the first people to shout, hooray, we have proven that God exists, if they had found evidence. But they didn't. All right, now that doesn't mean that someday prayers might be discovered as evidence. But the current situation is there are no prayers, and there should have been. By now, with billions of people praying every day throughout the world for thousands of years, you think one of the prayers would have been answered by now in a way that could be tested, not just on the basis of anecdotal evidence or stories and so on, but actual scientific justification. Another way that God might have been detected is by revelation. God is supposed to reveal truths to humans. Well, that's a perfectly testable scientific hypothesis, because if God revealed truths, there should have been some point in history where somebody said something that could be tested scientifically, not not by a prediction that was in the Bible that was later answered in the Bible, but by some phenomenon that the person couldn't possibly have known about, and later turns out to be true. Could be tested to be something simple like the date of the next Los Angeles earthquake, or something more complex. But that's perfectly testable. And so all throughout the phenomenal world, we can find examples of if God existed, where there should have been evidence. There should have been evidence for design in the universe. A lot of people claim they think they see design in the universe. But a scientist looking at the universe sees absolutely no sign of design. It looks totally undesigned. It looks like it should look if God does not exist. And this includes biology, this includes physics, this includes cosmology, and so on. We have perfectly workable scenarios for how the universe could have come about naturally. Not everybody necessarily agrees on them, but the point is that you can't use the existence of the universe itself as a God in the gaps argument, because we have plausible ways in which the universe could have come from nothing, how the laws of physics might have come from nothing, and so on. And as far as naturalism is concerned, I want to correct a statement that was made several times in the student debate today. Naturalism does not necessarily involve determinism. That was once the case when we had the Newtonian view of the universe, where everything was predetermined. But with quantum mechanics, we have the possibility of free will and so on, still viable within a material scenario. Again, I can make an assertion that I would have to take a book-length story, as I have it several times now, to show why it's valid, that everything that we know, everything that we see, everything we observe is fully consistent with a purely material view of the universe. Can particles think? Why not? Tell me why they can't. I spent my whole career studying particles, and so I don't see why people have against them. Why couldn't particles assemble in such a mean a way to do all the processes of the brain? There's absolutely no reason to believe they can't, and in fact we are beginning to see plenty of evidence that all our thinking processes are purely material. And that goes for every other observation that we make. There's absolutely no reason to introduce any kind of non-material element in the universe. The universe looks just like it should look if there is no God. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Vic Stenger. You've convinced me. A reaction on the yay side.
Well, one of the points I like to bring up in my own studies of both astrophysics as well as neuroscience, particularly in neuroscience, is what we call the hard problem of consciousness, where the concept of the quale, which is an ineffable, undescribable, but yet information laden occurrence in the human brain that cannot be described reductively. And in my presentation, I'll quote three different top scientists who say materialist reductionism will never explain the ineffable quality of experience. Why there is something that it is like to be a conscious being, or to experience the color red, or to taste chocolate. We can do all that science can ever do is create correlations between observations and consciousness. But consciousness itself, the hard problem, not the easy problem, but the hard problem, I don't believe we'll ever have a solution, and I can back that up with Nobel Prize-winning physicists and neuroscientists say the same.
Rejoinder from the nay side.
How many times have you heard a theist say, I can't believe, I can't understand how something could have come about naturally, therefore it must have come about supernaturally? Francis Collins says that a lot in his bestseller, The Language of God. I can't possibly see how this could have happened. You know what that's called? That's called the argument from ignorance. Just because you don't understand how something could have come about, that doesn't mean it couldn't have come about that way. There's absolutely no reason, no proof that has yet been made that matter can't think.
Well, Dr. Stenger has made a couple of comments in his writings that I think are as axiomatic of leaps of faith as anything a theist would say. One of his statements he's made is that complex order that we observe could not have been the result of any initial design built into the universe at the time of the so-called creation. And then later on he says, nothing is as simple as it gets. We cannot expect it to be very stable. This is part of his cosmology, that really the something we see has come out of a definition of nothing. And then I'd like Dr. Stenger to explain, because I really do want to understand, it would likely undergo a spontaneous phase transition to something more complicated, like a universe containing matter. I think the theist would argue that your spontaneous phase transition at least has some similarity to a notion of a prime mover or a divine intelligence. I'm curious what you mean.
Well, the idea is this: in nature, we're very familiar with phase transitions for example, in the case of water, from a vapor to a liquid to a solid. This is a natural transition. If you don't have the reason we're familiar with the opposite direction, ice melting and so on, is because we're in an environment with a lot of heat. Take away the heat. It's the heat it's the energy that's forcing that to happen. Take away the energy. Put this in a very cold environment, and you'll have a natural progression from the simple to the complex, from the highly symmetric to the highly asymmetric. And that is just an observation of nature. So it's postulated. Obviously, all of science is a series of assumptions that you check against experiment. But if you're looking for an explanation for the spontaneous appearance of something from nothing, you think of nothing, whatever it is. It's certainly very simple. The simplest thing you can imagine must be nothing. The most symmetric thing you can imagine must be nothing. So the natural tendency must be for nothing to become something. That would be, and to assume that it's the other way around, that nothing is more natural than something, has no basis. The way the world seems to operate is to move from simplicity to complexity. That's the big thing so many theists just don't seem to understand. They have that problem with evolution. They have how could you get all this stuff? How could we get all this complexity without God, without something even more complex stepping in? Well, that's not the way nature works. Learn something about science, and you'll find that the universe operates exactly the opposite way.
Can I make a quick follow-up?
Yes.
Yeah, it seems to me that in these accounts that you get from scientists who are trying to explain something from nothing, one of the things that you should always be listening for is whether they're ascribing properties to this nothing. Because if they are, they give it away that it's not really a nothing. So far we've heard that it's simple, that it's unstable. I presume there's a host of other qualities that are supposed to be features of this nothingness by which we explain how it becomes something. But clearly enough then, we're not talking about a nothing. Upon closer examination, it turns out to be something like fluctuations in a quantum field or something like this, which is very not like anything that we're familiar with, like bottles of water in books, but it is, after all, a something. So really, we're not getting an account of something from nothing at all.
Well, look, I failed to mention that there are several phenomena, several models of something from nothing, of how the universe came about naturally. For people like Hawking and so on, for famous people. I've worked out one myself in this book that you have sitting there. I'm glad you bought that book. It's my favorite book. Most people don't read it. The Comprehensible Cosmos is called. And I work out completely mathematically at a level of about undergraduate math, how a scenario, it's not proven, it doesn't prove that the universe happened that way, but a full scenario that shows consistent with all we know how you could have a transition. Our universe could have come about actually from an earlier universe by a means of something called quantum tunneling. But you have to get into the technical details to understand that.
And with that, I'll introduce our speaker for our next yay side. And I'd like to flag for the AV folks that there will be a PowerPoint component for this if you want to ready up the gizmo. Our next speaker has a PhD in planetary science and a Master of Science in Geophysics from the California Institute of Technology. Prior to coming to Drury University, Dr. Ojakangas was a professor of physics and geology at the University of Minnesota at Duluth. He was a visiting scientist at the Lunar and Planetary Institute in Houston. He's a consultant for the NASA Space Center. He was a postdoctoral research scientist at the Lunar and Planetary Laboratory at the University of Arizona, and is a finalist in NASA's astronaut selection program, maintaining a current application with NASA. His current work is in computational neuroscience and robotics. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Ojakangas.
All right, I'll just let you read that for yourself. I am honored to be here talking and discussing with these very distinguished opponents. And I am an astronomer as well as a budding or a neuroscientist. And I am just thoroughly excited about physics and neuroscience and the physical world. I will just humbly tell you my opinions on the issue of God. And so I brought an extra brain, thinking I might need it against my formidable opponents. I've been reading a lot of Dr. Stenger's writings, and I really enjoy them for the most part, because I'm in love with physics, and you know there are big questions: outer space and inner space. Both of them, I think, those are the ultimate questions. And if you lead down that road to the very end, you come to the place where the God of the gaps is no longer applicable, and we simply have to, and there is no reductive explanation. That is my opinion. One of the topics I've been reading about are the so-called large number coincidences. For example, it's fascinating. I found it fascinating to read that the large number, about the 10 to the 39th power, I believe, the ratio of the lifetime of a star to the time that it takes a beam of light or a photon of light to cross a proton. That is about the same huge number as the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force between two electrons. And it turns out it's not a coincidence. There are good reasons for it. Another number is the square of that number, which happens to be, it's the Eddington number, the number of particles in the observable universe. It's about 10 to the 79th power or so. But the human brain has approximately 100 billion ordinary neurons, plus about 10 times that much glial cells, which we don't quite understand yet. But the number of activation patterns in the human brain absolutely dwarfs those other huge numbers from outer space. And so the human brain is a spectacular thing, and I believe that we are all amazing creatures that are essentially miraculous in our complexity. So what I want to talk about is a little about inner space and then a little about outer space. I want to define the quale, and in neuroscience, the quale can be described this way. There are certain features of the bodily sensations, especially, but also certain perceptual experiences, which no amount of purely physical information includes. And I want to quote three absolutely top neuroscientists and their opinions. Gerald Edelman, winner of a Nobel Prize in 1972, said, "No physical theory can take us all the way to qualia." Those are his words. And Christoph Koch, a prominent Caltech neuroscientist, he says this: "Let's forget about the hard problem of consciousness," the problem which I brought up a little while ago, "because that may not have a scientific explanation." And then David Chalmers, who kind of championed the reemergence of the hard problem of consciousness, said this: none of the theories of consciousness, and in his book, The Conscious Mind, he goes through this, none of the theories can reductively explain the hard problem of consciousness. That is, why is there something that it is like to be a human being experiencing the color red or a taste? Because it is not the kind of thing that could possibly be explained reductively, and I would like to hear our opponents tell us how that can be done. So consciousness, interestingly, so consciousness, I believe, cannot be reductively explained. And there's some interesting, tantalizing possibilities that consciousness may actually continue during extended cardiac arrest, even with stored memories or knowledge apparently recorded. If consciousness can exist without a functioning brain, could there be conscious entities that are not housed in a body? For example, God. Now, there's a study currently going on, and we'll see the outcome of that, and see whether whether we get a positive, a need for a paradigm shift, because we certainly would need that if that were the case. And consciousness has many definitions, and there are many sub-definitions, but the kind that John Eckley's, another Nobel Prize-winning neuroscientist, talks about is self-consciousness, the ability to look at yourself, to examine yourself, and to have a knowledge of yourself and knowledge of your own knowledge. And is it true that consciousness can actually that the conscious mind can actually control the body, or is it all bottom up? Is causality always coming from the bottom toward the top, or is there top down causality? And there are very prominent scientists who believe in top down causality. The idea that a very complex system like a brain has an emergent property that cannot be described by the sum of its parts. And the Nobel Prize winning Belgian chemist Ilya Prigogine has actually shown that in some statistical mechanics equations can actually have solutions that do not depend on the underlying initial conditions of the particles that constitute a statistical system. So, okay, I simply want to tell you. What I've got? Oh, 1 minute. Oh my goodness. Okay, some of this will have to come up in discussion. Monte Carlo integration is a way of estimating the integral of a function without being able to sample all of the parameter space. We all sample reality, and we come to a belief system based on what we personally experience. And I believe that we personally, a lot of what we personally experience comes through quale. And I believe our knowledge of God comes through quale. And most of the most important things in life come through quale. For example, can I prove that I love my parents? I can't do that. Or can I explain to someone else what the color red is? Or my knowledge that God exists? Can I do that? And I can't, because these are ineffable qualities of quale. But yet they are information laden and they're very important. This topic often comes up, which is Bertrand Russell's teacup. There is a teapot between Venus and the Earth. And it's out there, and we're told to believe it. Why? Because you have to have faith. You have to believe in the teapot. Well, we believe in God like we believe in the dark energy, because we feel from our personal experience that there is a reality to it, and the way that we've sampled reality brings us to a decision that we believe there is a God. But I want to take that teapot down to the stove for a moment and heat up the water, and now it's boiling. And why is it boiling? I think our reductionist friends here would say it's boiling because the equilibrium vapor pressure has reached the prevailing atmospheric pressure. But I would say it's boiling because I want to make cups of tea for my new atheist friends. So there are different types of reasons. Is there a purpose for what we see in the universe beyond just a description of how it was done? I believe that even God has to have agents to perform what he does. And those agents are the laws of physics. I used to watch this show when I was a kid, Bewitched, and I used to think it was kind of silly the way that she would wiggle her nose, and all of a sudden an entire table full of food, and so on, and intricately created, crafted, would appear. And I think, who did that? Someone had to think about it. Someone had to come up with the details of the atomic structure. And so, it's silly to think that that those thoughts didn't have to go into it. There's I have a quote from God where he was. This is a fictional discussion between God and somebody, and God says, people think this creating a universe thing is easy. They think you just kind of wave your arms and move over the face of the waters, and then it just happens. It's not like that at all. And that's what science has revealed to us, that it's not like that at all. And there are all kinds of agents that have to be created, and they're brilliantly created. If we want to understand something and how it's made, we have to. Best thing to do is try to make one. This is why I made this robotic arm with my colleagues at school to try to explain how the brain controls many more muscles than degrees of freedom on the human arm. I'm going to have to cut it short here, but this is James Clerk Maxwell, who Albert Einstein described in this way: there was physics before James Clerk Maxwell, and then there was physics after James Clerk Maxwell. An absolute brilliant person, possibly a very good candidate for the greatest physicist of all time, who was also a devout Christian. And this is what he said. He said, when the form of an equation of physics is understood scientifically, we find that it rests on precisely the same foundation as Euclid does. That is, it is simply a contradiction of an absurdity out of which we may get our legs at last. So it is possible to believe in God and to believe that the laws of physics simply describe how God did it. Okay, so we're gonna have to cut this off. Possibly in our discussion later, we can get into some other issues.
Thank you very much, Greg. And a quick note about being draconian about the time. These rules were not my idea, and they were proposed, I think, by the panelists. So we're going to try to kind of keep to them. Thank you for that. And now a response from the nay side. Richard, carry on.
Yeah, I just want to clarify so that you understand our perspective, like what we actually view of here. When you're talking about reductive explanation, it's important to note that when I talk about reductivism, let's put it that way. When I mean reductivism, I don't mean reducing it just to the parts. It's not just about atoms. It's not just what it's made of. It's also the pattern into which it's arranged, the actual physical shape of it, the way the parts interact, and so forth. That pattern of arrangement is also part of what you reduce it to, and that's still physical, the fact of it being arranged that way. And so you take, for example, a computer that you can build logic circuits in, and you can have that computer logically navigate its way around a room without even telling it anything about that room. Once the parts are arranged in the right way, the property, the power of that computer to do that emerges from that, and there's nothing, you can reduce it all to just the logic circuits and the pattern of arrangement. So when we're talking about reductive explanation, that's what we mean. It's a little more complicated than just atoms, for example. Now when I say that, to get to your argument about qualia, that's all preface to that. What I see in brain science is a trend going in one direction. Every single question we've had in brain science has been solved by a physical discovery. For example, the reason that we see 4 colors. We know why it's red, green, blue, and yellow. We know why. We have 3 particular cones that detect particular photons and particular frequencies, and these colors line up with those frequencies. And we have 3 of those, and then the yellow particular color is actually created in a particular part of the visual precortex. It uses some of that data to sort of guess where yellow is as well, using different cones playing off of each other in the eye cells. Now, the fact that we explained that much, now of course that's not the hard problem. I realize that's not what you're talking about. But the reason I bring that up is that's a lot of explanation that we've accomplished with physics and not having to do any kind of, it's not the Cartesian soul or anything that's seeing the colors. The reason we have a particular number of colors, why it's 4, is fully explained by the physical mechanism and we can see it. Now we can go in, we don't have the ability now to detect exactly where the color yellow is processed in the brain, but we know roughly where it is. It actually has a particular location in the brain. We could theoretically go in and cut it out, and that person would never see yellow again, for example. And we know we could actually stimulate yellow by putting an electrode down there and causing it and so forth. So we know it's a physical circuit that's generating these colors. So the question then becomes, how do the circuits do it? Now let's suppose we went all the way down to basic explanation. We found the different shapes of the circuits. One is yellow, one is red, and we saw they're physically different. The physical differences would then explain the differences in experience. Now what you're asking is, the hard problem is, why is it red? Why does it feel like red rather than, why does it feel like yellow rather than something? What I would say is, let's wait until science gets there. We can't really just leap to the conclusion and say that science is never going to answer that question. People have said that science is never going to answer all kinds of questions, and science has come around and answered them. I remember one of the silliest examples is the bumblebee flight. I've heard some people say, no one can ever explain how the bumblebee flies, therefore it's a proof of God. That's a really lame argument, I'm sure you agree. But the fact is, science went around and explained the aerodynamics of the bumblebee. So I just don't buy the argument that because we don't know what the explanation will be now, that it'll never be. And what I do is I look at the trend of the evidence. The trend of the evidence is going one way. So that's our perspective on it. Does that illuminate where our position is, I think?
Sure, but the issue is as David Chalmers had said, that reductive science is not even the kind of inquiry that could possibly explain qualia. And as a scientist, I can, and he puts it this way, if you believe this, you feel it in your bones. You can tell right from the beginning, how on earth is reductive science going to explain this? Because it was a whole different thing, observing the observer, as opposed to the observer observing the universe. And being inside the conscious mind and experiencing that, I just don't see how it will ever be done. So that's one response. Okay. I was also wondering why you didn't mention the other two subtractive primaries, magenta and cyan. Because there's 6.
Yeah, that's true. But by the way, those don't correspond to any actual photons. Magenta doesn't, for example. Magenta is actually a fabricated color in the brain. There's no photon frequency that corresponds to it.
Right, it's a combination of red and blue.
Yeah,
equal amounts.
Quick response on this side?
I have 2 things real quick I want to throw out there. You just said I have no idea. Science is not going after this in any way that could ever answer the question of the redness of red or those type of problems. And even if I concede you're right, I don't know enough about the subject to say whether or not you're right. But even if I concede you're right, if we knew how to go about it, we would be. Just because we don't currently know how to go about it doesn't mean at one point we won't be. I mean, as a physicist, at one point we had no idea how to go after dark matter. You couldn't have made that argument then. The other thing I have to say is when you talked at the end about, and in your talk you said our personal experience leads us to believe that there's a God. And this has always struck me as very, very odd from a Christian standpoint, because to be a Christian, you must believe that all other religions are wrong. If Jesus is the Son of God, Islam is not true, Hinduism is not true, so on and so forth. If that's the case, then believers of every other religion from now until the end of time, or before our time, must have been either lying, deluded, or crazy, because they can't be right. But the thing is, if you admit that, then you acknowledge that human beings have a tendency to be lying, deluded, crazy, when talking about God. They have to be for you to be right. What rescues you and your personal experience from being tied to that same boat?
Well, let me respond to that first off, that the parameters of what we're speaking about have to do with theism. And,
right. But more broadly construed, not focused on a defense of Christian apologetics. Yeah.
First of all, and the other thing is whether you're talking from a generally monotheistic perspective or any of the particular subsets that Dr. Stenger brought up, the fact that people disagree on the nature of their experiences, the fact that people have a variety of perceptions of what they're experiencing is not a contradiction in their disagreement, that those experiences exist and are worthy of evaluation, and we don't feel are reducible to physical or material causes. So within all the world religions, you will describe as true or deceptive or varying degrees, but it doesn't invalidate the fact that there are unexplainable experiences or experiences that we don't think are adequately explained by a material perspective.
Okay.
And with that, we'll continue with the program. We'll hear from someone on the nay side, either why there's insufficient evidence to warrant belief in God, or maybe why there's reason to disbelieve in God, or to believe positively that God doesn't exist. Our next speaker, well, aside from being a blogger, he is co-founder of the Missouri State University chapter of the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster, as well as founder and lead organizer of these great Skepticon events. He's spoken and participated in debates in several venues around this region on topics of religion, reason, the role of faith in society. He will be graduating from Missouri State University in May with a degree in vocal performance, some of which you're about to hear in a sense. Please join me in welcoming J.T. Eberhard.
Yeah, the side wanted me to come up here and sing Nessun Dorma, and I told them no. All right. I want to talk about what it means to know something. We often hear this phrase, science hasn't proven that God doesn't exist or can't explain something like that. And I think this doesn't take into account what it means to say we actually know something. I don't think you can absolutely know anything. For instance, take something we're all fairly sure about right now, that there are no leprechauns. Every time I say this, I expect to see like some angry Irish guy get up and walk out. But I think we can all pretty much agree there's no leprechauns. Can I prove this? Well, no. But it's really very odd. If someone were to say to me, there are no leprechauns, I would immediately ask him, well, or someone would say to me, there are leprechauns, I would immediately ask him, where? And I would ask him to show me. And even if he said, well, I don't know where they are, but I've seen evidence of where they are, I'd say, where is the evidence? And what's to say if he says, well, I have no evidence? I have a leprechaunus divinus sensus, or something along those lines. The thing is, in order to be open-minded, we have to grant possibilities to even the most absurd claims. Maybe one day we'll turn over a rock on this planet, on another planet, and we'll find a leprechaun hiding somewhere. It's very possible. Well, it's not very possible, but it's at least possible. But I admit the possibility. And so therefore I cannot be absolutely certain there are no leprechauns. And I admit that. Even Richard Dawkins, when asked, if you were to place your certainty in God's existence on a scale from 1 to 7, what did he say? 6? I'm a 6. I'm not absolutely certain. And that's fine. Admitting these possibilities lets us have an open mind. So if we ever do find a leprechaun, I'll change my mind. Promise. But when we talk about knowing something, we always talk about knowledge in terms of probability. When you say you know there are no leprechauns, you're not saying you're absolutely certain. You're not saying you have combed this universe to its very edges to make sure. You're not saying there's no centimeter of space-time, which Dr. Stenger will admit is a really weird concept in and of itself, a centimeter of space-time. But you haven't done that. But you can still say you know there are no leprechauns, and that's fine. I apply the exact same thing to God. If someone says to me, I know there's a God, fine. Where is he? Well, I don't know where he is, but there's evidence. Okay, what's the evidence? But it's always very weird when they say, shouldn't you prove he doesn't exist? I wonder how they would react to the leprechaun argument. Would they ask me to prove that leprechauns don't exist? So when we say we don't think there's a God, we're just saying that it's far more probable that there is no God. Someday, some experiment may be conducted that confirms that God answers prayers, that confirms that we need a God in the universe. But until that time, we can't say, well, you can't absolutely prove it. No, we will never be able to. But we can, right now, at this very moment, with all of the knowledge that human beings have accrued, say, far and away, the greatest probability is that there is no God. When we look at the universe, all we see are natural forces acting on inanimate objects. They produce order in our universe all the time. Recall my talk from the student debate. If you have a large enough hydrogen cloud, such that gravity will act on it, it will start to pull in on itself, the temperature in the middle will spike, and you'll start having hydrogen fuse into helium, which creates a very, very complex star. No appeal to God is necessary for the creation of stars. These are the processes that govern our universe. Mindless forces acting on inanimate objects, producing order. It does us no good to say the brain is far more complex than any star. I admit the brain is complex. But we have mechanics in operation that produce complexity over a great matter of time. You cannot just flat out say that because we have complexity in this particular case, a God must have done it. You have to have some evidence that God would need to stick his hand in to have that happen. And once, as Charlie self said, I want to be educated. If such evidence exists, I'm open to hear it. After all, I do allow the percentage chance off in the distance that both leprechauns and God exist. For what we have not explained, we have to fill in the metaphysical holes. Even if we don't know why we feel the redness of red or why we love our parents, although I'd argue that biology suggests precisely why we feel like we love our parents, we may know one day. To say that we can't explain it, we don't know how it's done, therefore God, even if you're planning on the future of us answering that question and finding the evidence, you're still basing your current worldview right here in the present off information we don't have. And you can never formulate a coherent worldview in that way. So, bear in mind, whenever they're providing evidence, for instance, personal experience, what is more likely? For the argument of personal experience, is it more likely that we just have it as a consequence of our evolution, of our brain's evolution? Or is it more likely that a God out there somewhere wants a relationship with us in a very ineffective and odd way? Thank you.
And now for a response from the yay side. Zach.
Yeah, let me start. There are a number of points that I wish we had time to address here, but let's start with the claim that we always think about knowledge in terms of probability. Well, this seems to me demonstrably false. I mean, everybody in here believes that there are other people in the room with them. Now, let me ask you, how many of you arrived at that belief like this? I appear to have I'm having an experience right now of an appearance of people around me. There's a high probability that when I have experiences of that type, there are in fact people around me. Therefore, there are people around me. Raise your hand. How many people arrived at your belief that there are people in the room in that manner? Not many. Not many. And if you do, well, you have different kinds of issues that we should address. But the problem with this line of argument is that it just doesn't match up with the ways that we know most of the things that we know. Ordinary knowledge, like perceptual beliefs about what you see around you, for example, they are the result of the proper functioning of your epistemic faculties. They don't involve assignments of probabilities or considerations about what's probable relative to what. So the first thing is that it seems to me the account of knowledge that we've been given is not going to account for most of our ordinary knowledge. There's a lot that's being insisted by way of the evidentialist thesis that I talked about, but as far as I can tell, no attempt to try to rebut the arguments that I gave against evidentialism that show that evidentialism is implausible. But JT said something very interesting right from the beginning. He says, we can't absolutely know anything. So it may be that he's just willing to embrace skepticism. But if he is, let me tell you what he's saying. He's saying he doesn't know that there are people in the room with him. And if it turns out that that's the kind of epistemic position that you need to embrace in order to be an atheist, then that seems to me that atheism is not an especially plausible view.
Response from the nay side on that argument that you need certain knowledge, not just reliable knowledge?
Sure. For our brains to get us through the day, we have to construct models of the world in order to figure out problems. For instance, can you prove that you can't open a door by scratching your head? Maybe one day it'll work that way. So you construct a model. The door is tangible, I have an arm, and that's a supposition in and of itself. I reach out, I turn the handle, I open the door. Can I prove that absolutely? No. Talking about people in the room, you've all arrived at the conclusion there are other people in this room. Well, can you prove you're not a brain in a jar somewhere feeding you this matrix-like image? Probably not. So you assign a probability to it. It's like, of all the possibilities that fairies are feeding me this image, or I'm a brain in a jar, it seems far most likely that I'm in a room with other people. I need to acknowledge this in order to get about my day. And that's how you experience your lives.
So you're skeptical, but the skepticism is a mitigated skepticism.
Right.
It's not a full throttle.
I'd like to complete that thought, actually.
Yeah, please.
The one thing that's overlooked here is that you're talking about how people aren't reasoning, like when they assume there's people around them, they aren't reasoning it out in a particular way. The fact of the matter is we did that as children. Most of the fundamental beliefs that we assume about the physical reality, about the nature of the universe, about the conservation of matter, about the existence of other people, the existence of other minds, we were figuring that all out as kids, so we got those theories settled through evidence at the time. So now as adults, we're assuming all those theories that we nailed as children are correct, and we just operate that way, so we don't rethink it anymore until we have a reason to. For example, if we're on an acid trip, we might have a reason to rethink these questions. But if you study child development, we see that children don't know these things. They don't know, for example, that if you take this cup and put it under the table, that it's still there. They don't know that other people exist, or they don't understand about other minds. They don't understand about emotion. except at certain stages of development they figure it out. And it's not like they just spontaneously get that information as if it's being teleported in there by God. They're figuring it out by experimenting on the world, building models. Of course, it's not like in language or not writing it out and for, you know, doing a logical syllogism or anything, but their brain is doing the logical operations of figuring out how the world works and how best to model what's going on in the world. And they come up with these theories of other minds and so forth, people around them and so on. And those theories work so well that they stick with them. So I think, you know, I don't accept the sort of narrow evidentialism, as I said. That's not my view. But I think even you're kind of straw manning even how narrow evidentialism would answer your question, because this reality of the fact that we have reasoned out that way, we're not doing it now. We won't have to because we've figured out all those stuff already. So I think that completes what his point was. And,
Response over here to that charge of skepticism.
Well, I think that I want to respond to a term they've both used, and that's the word model, and how they arise. Our friends here say that our models arise from our experiences. They arise from our processing of those experiences, and then we construct models and test those models. I think that's a fair assessment. What's interesting to me is that in this entire debate, what you have is each side putting the burden of proof on the other, because you have a theistic model, and we're not going to deny that we have a model from which we operate, to which we find the evidence that we experience consistent with it, and vice versa. And I think we need to understand that there is that debate on where the burden of proof lies. There is also, so that's one aspect. The other aspect is we all do have models. The question is, how are we testing them? We haven't even brought up, Dr. Stenger briefly mentioned anecdotal evidence versus tested evidence, but a lot of anecdotal evidence turns into history. So we want to be very careful before we just dismiss narrative or dismiss experiences. The cumulative evidence from a variety of sources can reinforce or call into question the different models that we construct.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with what you said, both that final point and the idea that the burden issue. I think actually the burden lies on both of us. I say that for me particularly because I'm a naturalist, so I'm defending a particular worldview. I'm not just I could take the position that I don't really know which worldview is true and be a worldview agnostic. In that case, the burden wouldn't fall on me.
Right.
But I don't take that position because I think there's really good evidence that naturalism in particular is true. So I think the burden is on both of us, and I fully share that. And I have no problem.
Yeah.
Yes, one thing I would like to clarify that might help here is that philosophers such as Immanuel Kant and Schopenhauer have shown that there's really two realities. There's the phenomenal reality and the noumenal reality. That the noumenal reality we really know nothing about. Yeah, that's where God would reside, actually. But I claim all we have is our phenomenal reality, which is all in our heads. The laws of physics are all in our heads. The laws of physics were invented by humans. All of our concepts, these models that we talked about, they're all invented. Space and time are invented concepts. They're used to describe what we observe, and that's all we know. This is the claim that I am making. That's all we know, and we have no real way of knowing about this noumenal. I don't know if there are really neutrinos in the noumenal reality, and I don't know if there's a God out there, but he clearly doesn't have anything to do with this world. He doesn't have any effect. The only thing that matters is in the phenomenal world, because that's the only world we deal with. We don't have to predict what's going on in this other metaphysical realm, because that metaphysical realm doesn't seem to have any effect whatsoever on the rest of us.
And with that, I'd like to introduce our last speaker for the yay side, that God does exist in some way. Maybe not the Christian God, but God. Our next speaker has earned 4 degrees, all pursued while in full-time ministry. He has 3 degrees in history, including his PhD from the University of California, Santa Cruz, with a focus on ethics and religion. He also has an MA in philosophical and systematic theology from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California. He's the co-author of The Power of Faithful Focus, a practical Christian guide to spiritual and personal abundance, and he's currently associate professor of church history at the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary here in Springfield. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Charlie Self.
We've got a lot of cool slides from Greg here, so
Unfortunately,
I'm just going to go forward.
Here, let's
You go
do
ahead
this.
and
I'll
find
get your thing on there. Here we go.
Go to the second slide.
There we go.
He's by far got the cool slides. Theism, I believe, is a coherent and intelligent worldview that continues to animate human life with meaning and purpose. I think some well-informed people do embrace theism. Now, I had the privilege of growing up in a home that was committed to free inquiry, moral integrity, and respect for people of faith. My neighborhood was unique. I was on 508 East Bunny Avenue in Santa Maria, California. We had Hungarians across the street, Jewish and Catholic friends around the corner, skeptics and atheists, and all kinds of people in my little corner of the woods, and I could not understand why in the 1960s people got mad at each other, because we all got along pretty well. When I was 12 years old, my father wrote in his Harvard alumni journal that I was a fiery humanist and a repressed basketball star. Too short. My pilgrimage toward authentic, intelligent theism led me to embrace faith as a young adult, but I continue to look at these issues honestly, and I am intrigued and will continue to devour the works of our colleagues here to my right, your left, for I really believe that they are investigating things that are worthy of our consideration. I'm a regional signer of the Williamsburg Charter, a celebration of our First Amendment. The first 16 words of our First Amendment give the open door to genuine inquiry and people of all faiths or none debating their deepest differences with civility, and you're watching that today. I'm proud that my signature is next to Coretta Scott King and Norman Lear, next to Elie Wiesel and Billy Graham, next to atheists, next to believers. My Cal College motto at UC Santa Cruz was the pursuit of truth in the company of friends, and I'm happy to make 3 new friends today, and I hope many more here in the audience. As theists, we answer today's question, does God exist, with a resounding yes, contending that religious belief is reasonable and warranted by a fair examination of the phenomena of human experience as well as the other sciences of history and science itself. Dr. Carrier in his writings has asserted that given enough time, all that we experience is or will be explainable by natural processes, and we do not need any supernatural intervention. And I want to be fair to represent that well, and you'll hear from him in a moment to better represent that. So I'm not claiming that my opponents claim omniscience. Dr. Stenger considers belief in God a failed hypothesis, that religious people have been indoctrinated, that a fully liberated and thoughtful person will choose atheism if given an opportunity, free from the debilitating effects of family or religious communities. I think my teammates have done well to bring evidence, to bring ideas that support the coherence of theism. I want to bring 3 or 4 arguments, part of a cumulative argument of pointers to the reasonableness of theism today. I agree with A.N. Wilson that theism is a deeper and wiser and more rounded perspective. The thoughtful person's cry for justice, in the words of N.T. Wright, is one echo of a divine voice that seems universal and not reducible to biology. The companion to this cri de coeur is our capacity for altruistic action and sacrificial love. I think the moral argument remains compelling. Why do we know there is some kind of right and wrong? Atheist Kai Nelson put it this way: pure practical reason, even with a good knowledge of the facts, will not take you to morality. R.Z. Friedman argued that respect for persons and survival of the fittest are mutually exclusive. Richard Carrier has argued that we should be moral because we will be happier as a moral person overall than if you become some other kind of person. And by the way, I want to be very clear when I speak of morality and ethics. I really believe that all of humankind is capable of that. I'm not making it the exclusive preserve of theists. Our love of beauty and extravagant creativity is another pointer to God. Beyond anthropological attraction for a mate, beyond religious ritual, humans create. We paint on cave walls, we sculpt figurines, we devise new technologies. I think our capacities for innovation point to God, a divine creator whose creative instincts we naturally image. Our self-consciousness and self-awareness seems to distinguish us from other creatures here on earth. Our spirituality and capacity for supra-rational experiences is another reflection of God. I do not believe we can reduce ineffable dimensions of human life to mere neurons. Now, our opponents want to invalidate transcendent experiences, or at least reduce them, it seems to me, to the epiphenomena of our particular biology and environment. My opponents have argued that there is no proof for the supernatural, that there are millions of proofs of natural phenomena, therefore there's no need of God. In response, I will only say that just one unexplainable miracle validated seems to open the door to invalidating absolute naturalism. Supernatural phenomena are testified to by people of sane and educated orientation. The infinite detail of the microcosmic and the vast expanse of the macrocosm seem to awaken in humankind religious impulses and a belief in God. I won't call that an infallible proof, but it's certainly a plausible explanation. In fact, something coming from nothing is as axiomatic as believing that there was an intelligent creator who got the entire process started in the beginning. I wonder if information can self-assemble all by itself. Our opponents see chaos, randomness, violence, and waste in the evolutionary process and state categorically there is no God or there are reasons to no longer believe. Theists look at the same evidence, united with the beauty, functionality, and power, and say, what a wonderful yet flawed world it is. And finally, I would say that the limitations, and here JT and I agree, the limitations of our knowledge is a call to humility. My opponents point toward our advancements in scientific knowledge as a sign of no longer needing a God hypothesis. I think our advances in knowledge are wonderful, but they reveal how little we know. The explosion of knowledge in our age has not transformed our character, ethics, or relational abilities by itself. I think we've demonstrated, and will continue to do so, that religious belief is warranted. It's not a circumvention of critical thinking. Theists do have some axiomatic starting points. Atheists exercise equal amounts of credulity when they proffer theories of an eternal universe or something coming from nothing, or, to be broader, the givenness of the world that we see today. Finally, and as a preacher you say finally at least twice, the greatest pointer to God's existence is love. When we seek the good of others more than our own, we are choosing beyond pleasure, narcissism, or survival. Love is not the preserve of only religious people, but it is an indication that we're more than biology and physics. Nurturing a baby, ameliorating suffering, remaining faithful in relationships all posit that we're more than accidental and destined for more than decay. Atheist Matthew Paris, after watching religious relief workers in Malawi, seeing their sacrificial compassion, he said that their work confounds my ideological belief, stubbornly refuses to fit into my worldview, and has embarrassed my growing belief that there is a God. Though we will not agree, all of us in this room, I think theism is coherent, it's intelligent, is an equally plausible explanation for what we see and experience around us. Thank you very much.
Well, a response from the nay side, maybe on the moral question or any of the other points.
Whole speech, very nice speech, many noble thoughts, a lot of statements, I believe this, I believe that, no proof, no evidence. Everything that he said that was noble would be agreed to by an atheist. There's absolutely no reason why the particles in our brain can't do all the stuff he's talking about, love and all that. He has no, it's just something he would like to believe. And I'm telling you that it doesn't provide any basis whatsoever for belief.
Response on the A side?
Do you want to jump in? I'll jump in.
Zach,
because,
Greg?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick
Charlie?
here. I made assertions as to the pointers toward God. Proof of each of those arguments require more depth, but I would argue one thing, that maybe I should have said it more clearly, that I don't think that these phenomena, these experiences, these ideas are reducible to the current state of materialism or to natural causes. And the other thing that I would assert is that the ground of ethics and morality, not the reality of it, But the ground of it is best explained in theism. The reality of it is shared by all, but the ground of it is distinct. The same thing goes for aesthetics, beauty, relationships. The ground of those, I don't think, are reducible. Now, we can, again, we'll back and forth about that.
So response on the nay side, that particular charge, look, evolution or science may explain something about how our morality evolved, but it doesn't justify it. It's not a grounding for it. What's your response? Sure, as JT was talking about earlier, we can understand something about our moral sense with great apes or something, but it alone doesn't justify that we should have that particular moral sense.
Yeah, exactly. Ultimately, any argument about justification, moral justification, has to appeal to something that the agent desires. You can't talk to an agent and say, well, you're going to go to hell, for example, if you don't behave morally. If that agent has no desire to avoid hell, that argument is going to have no effect on them. It's meaningless. Sure. So you have any type of argument you say you should be moral, you ought to be moral, this is your reason. It has to appeal to values that that agent already has. They have to already have it. You can't give it to them. You can't argue them into it. And the reality is, with the evolution argument, is that we have evolved to have certain values. They're built in. They're there. We were born with them. They're in our genes. And we also, through the nature of our culture, are raised to adopt even more values, not only from being taught them, but even more importantly, from learning them by interaction with our environment. For example, when we look at child development, we see how children go through stages of moral development, and they do so by learning what works for them and what doesn't. And certain particular behaviors result in dysfunctional environments that they don't like, whereas other behaviors result in greater happiness, greater harmony with their environment, and greater harmony with their society. So even children, especially if they're not in a dysfunctional family, but if they're in a functional family, will actually learn just through experimenting what the best sort of moral system is for themselves. And what they're doing is they are appealing to values they already have. They want to be happy. They want to be content. They want to enjoy the company of other people. They want friendship is a good feeling for them. Love is a good feeling for them because we're social animals. We evolved for these things. It's like, a fish out of water. If you're a fish out of water, you're going to die. It's the same thing with a human. A human who's away from human society and social interaction and love and connection and so forth is like a fish out of water. I mean, we evolved for that particular environment. So the foundation of morality ultimately has to appeal to values we already have, and you can build a moral system based on that by just arguing from that. And since naturalism already explains where those foundational values came from, that's our justification. We don't need any other.
Response?
Yeah, it seems to me, and part of this is coming from reading Professor Carrier's blog, it seems to me that what he's arguing for is what philosophers would call morality as a system of hypothetical imperatives. Big phrase, here's what it means. That what you get are obligations, moral duties, based on desires. And they're in an if-then format like this. Here's the example he has on his website. If you're a surgeon and you don't want your patient to die of infection, then you ought to sanitize your medical instruments. And so that's a factual claim, right? We know that that's true on the basis of evidence. And suppose, as is reasonable, the doctor does indeed have that desire not to kill his patient. Then you ought to sanitize your surgical instruments. So lo and behold, what we've gotten is an ought, a claim about what you ought to do, from an is, actually two of them. Here's the trouble with that kind of reasoning. What you end up with is not actually a moral obligation. And I think the most dramatic way to illustrate this is to imagine Hitler reasoning along these lines. If I want to exterminate the entire Jewish people, then I ought to come up with more efficient means of extermination, of execution. I do, in fact, want to exterminate all the Jews. Therefore, I ought to construct more deadly devices for execution. Now, I take it that this is as obvious an example as we can get of what is not a moral obligation. But that's the kind of reasoning that's been used to get there. So if this is the best that we get on an atheist worldview, we don't ever get actual moral obligations. We get obligations, if that's what you would want to call this conclusion, that could be horrendous.
Yeah.
So because that was directed at your blog, Richard, a response?
That's a straw man argument, because that's actually not what I argue. In my book in particular, I actually use the exact example of arguing Nazis out of their point of view. And I actually point out that Nazi beliefs are based on factually false information. Their whole idea that Jews were subhumans is factually false. You can actually demonstrate that to them. The idea that it's even a good idea to go around thinking that about people, it creates a dysfunctional society. I mean, if you look at the way Nazi society worked, it didn't really work very well for the people who were in it, and it certainly didn't end very well for the people who were in it. And I think in that particular case, what I would do if I were in a room with Hitler if he were a reasonable person, and he might not be, he might be insane, he might be incorrigible. But what I would do is try to reason from the values he already has to show him, well, these are the actual facts. Your facts are wrong. These are the correct facts. First, I would get him to agree with that because I have to show him evidence, show him the evidence that his views don't necessarily from the assumptions that he's going on. But if his assumptions are false, that entire moral system is false.
So
And-
the way
and it's
that
the
you would
same with
tell
Nazism.
the way that you would tell Hitler that he's wrong is like a fact-based argument.
I would,
Your
I would
claims
begin
are-
by first correcting all of his mistaken facts, and then if we still disagreed, then it would have to be some sort of issue where he doesn't see where his values are connecting with the facts. And ultimately, we could end up in a situation where if he's a total sociopath, then maybe there isn't any argument that I can give. But then he's a sociopath, and in my view, as I explain in my book, if he's a sociopath, he's a monster, and if he's a monster, he doesn't even belong to the moral realm. He is like a shark or a dangerous spider or something, and we have to treat him accordingly. That he is an enemy to us. In the same way that the Christians would view Satan or demons and so forth, they're incorrigible. You can't morally reason with them anymore.
One response over here?
Yeah, really quick. The only kind of facts that are going to work for the antecedent of this sort of conditional, this if-then statement, are facts about your desires or your wants, right? He called it your values. So the thing is, it's not going to matter that the belief that Hitler has is a false belief, which of course it is. What matters is that he believes it. It's a fact about your beliefs and values that has to be used to motivate this. So the mere fact that he has this belief, this awful desire, that's what's going to be driving the hypothetical imperative. And so the problem remains.
Well, no, that's not the problem, though. I agree that if he has false beliefs, that's going to drive a false moral system. But I'm talking about if you're going to have a true moral system, it has to be based on true facts. I mean, by definition, if it's not based on true facts, it's not a true moral system.
And with that, because we're really interested in having a little more audience Q&A, we'll continue with the presentation. Then we'll be able to maybe touch on some of these points as we go on. Our last presenter on the nay side, and I'm seeing a look from Vic Stenger. I'll owe him a drink for cutting him off. Our last presenter on the nay side is Richard Carrier. He's author of Sense and Goodness Without God, as well as numerous articles online and in print. He received his PhD in ancient history from Columbia University in 2008, and now specializes in the modern philosophy of naturalism, the origins of Christianity, and the intellectual history of ancient Greece and Rome. Join me in welcoming Dr. Richard Carrier.
Okay, yeah. I can only briefly summarize my reasons for concluding there is no God, and I can only cover a few of them. I obviously don't have a lot of time to go into full detail. There are many more I could go on, but these are the big ones. The first is, and I've even mentioned this already in the course of the debate, is the historical trend in discovered explanations. If we go way back 2,000 years ago, we had explained all kinds of things with God did it. God exists because lightning struck this person. We have lightning, the weather, disease, the organization of the solar system, the origin of complex animals. All of these things we thought God explained them. But in the actual historical trend has been that we found that those hypotheses were false. God doesn't cause lightning. God is not responsible for the weather. God is not responsible for the organization of the solar system. We can explain all of these things in terms of actual natural causes. And this, to me, is a testable theory. We're looking at a test of a theory. So far, the God hypothesis has no testable predictions. You can't start from God and then predict something is going to be observed and then go and see it, except when the predicted observation is exactly what naturalism also predicts. So, for example, in atheism, we have the same thing where we say it's not God. If you take any particular thing, lightning, disease, and so forth, we say it's not God versus it is God. The it's not God hypothesis has won out every time. We've proved it's correct. So we could come up with 1,000 examples of where the it's not God hypothesis has been verified. And we can come up with 1,000 examples where the it's God hypothesis has been refuted. And what I see is that the trend over history is when you get, if you've got two horses in a race, one wins 1,000 races, every single race it's ever won, and the other horse has never won any of those 1,000 races yet. And any particular remaining questions that there are where we can't explain something, you're going to put those two horses up against each other again. Which horse are you going to bet on? Obviously, you're going to bet on the one that's won every 1,000 of its races, and you're not going to bet on the one that's lost every race it's ever run. So even when we come to all the things we can't explain yet, I'm looking at the trend, and the trend is making a very high prior probability that what we're going to see is the explanations will come out as naturalism rather than theism. Now that in and of itself wouldn't be sufficient for me, but there are other evidences as well. And in fact, that one particular piece of evidence could be refuted if these other things were actually resolved. And the second one that I'll point to is what's called divine silence. Basically, to put it bluntly, all God has to do is talk to me. I mean, it's quite simple. If he shows up one day at my house, I'll definitely make time for him, no problem. He can do it with an apparition, he can send an angel, it doesn't matter. All he's got to do is talk to me himself. Yeah, I've got questions. I mean, if he wants me to believe, there are certain things that need to be answered, that deeply need to be answered, and I would love to, pick his brain on that and see what his answers are. Now, that to me is another test. If God wants me to be saved, if God wants me to believe in him, if God even gives a damn about me at all, people who want to save me, people who give a damn about me, they talk to me. They come over and give me a talking to, have a conversation, will answer my questions. So all God has to do is come to me and explain the gospel himself. There's nothing really stopping him from doing that. I welcome him if he would do it. Now, we can test this on a larger scale, and that's something we've also brought up with the sensus divinitatis. If God were to behave this way, as the whole God hypothesis predicts he should have been doing this with everyone all the way back throughout history. We should have records going back to ancient Chinese shaman talking about, yeah, God preached me the gospel back then even. We would have agreement on the records of God being a nice guy and just chatting with people and telling them what they need to know to live a good life and to gain salvation, the things he wants for them. So this is a prediction that the God hypothesis makes, in my view. The fact that the prediction doesn't bear out is one of the refutations of the theory. Whereas the atheist hypothesis predicts that what we should have is not this, but complete disagreement over history, men making up religions, thousands of man-made religions. That's what atheism predicts. That's what we observe. So in both cases, in the first issue and this issue, atheism predicts something, and that's what we observe. Theism predicts something else, and that's not what we observe. Now another one is divine inaction. Now I think there's a lot of excuses made for why God doesn't do anything, but I think certainly God ought to protect the innocent from either the evil of men or the evils of nature. And I have a particular story about this. There's one famous case that's often cited for parents to be very cautious about the handling of meat. There was a particular case where this kid's parents were preparing hamburgers for eating, and there was a little piece of hamburger that hadn't been cooked that was sitting on a counter, and the parents were busy, obviously, as they can't keep your eye on your child every single second of every day. He grabbed that piece of meat and ate it. Well, he got E. coli poisoning, and he was dead within 2 hours. Even despite having rushed him to the ER, they provided all modern medicine possible, he died, nevertheless. Now, it seems to me this is unconscionable behavior to allow that. Now, you can explain why the parent might have allowed it, because it's not possible, it's not their fault, they couldn't keep track of it. They probably could have been a little more conscious about keeping that away from their children and so forth. But nevertheless, God is a moral agent who doesn't have those excuses. He's not frazzled, he's not limited in resources, he doesn't make mistakes, right? This is another testable theory. If you put a moral agent in a room and no moral acts occur in that room, you've pretty much refuted the existence of that moral agent. You can't say there's a moral agent in that room and not everything that you would predict a moral agent would do by definition, or what a moral agent is, never happens in that room. Then you can conclude that moral agent isn't there. And of course, atheism predicts that there is no moral agent there, which is a great explanation for why there is no moral acts occurring. And I think it would have been very simple for God to basically stop that child and go, oh wait, you shouldn't eat that piece of meat. And if you might not be able to understand why now, but you shouldn't do it. Or he could physically move the piece of meat. I mean, there are certain things that God could do that certainly I would do. And the basic point is I can't be more compassionate than God. Certainly if God is less compassionate than me, in fact, so uncompassionate that he just dispassionately sits by and watches a kid eat something that's going to kill him, that to me is unconscionable. Certainly I can't be kinder than God, right? So to me, this is another example of a failed prediction of theism, whereas it's exactly what atheism predicts. Atheism predicts there is no God in the sky to help us out. So we really have to help each other and look out for ourselves. So we need to teach parents, for example, about proper meat handling. God's not going to do that for us. Now, another example is a little harder to explain. Now, those are the three big ones, actually. The ones I just went over are pretty big. I mean, they're pretty simple to explain, but the fact of the matter is, if you could honestly, genuinely resolve them, not with excuses, not with specious reasoning, not with assumptions and so forth, if you could actually demonstrate all of those things, if the world worked differently, if God were talking to me, if God were helping kids out, if God were acting like a moral agent, if the historical trend were different, if we actually had more confirmations of supernatural phenomena, then I would be a believer. It's quite simple. But I'm going to continue. I'm going to give you another example. This one's a little harder to explain, so it takes a little longer to go through it. The universe itself looks more like an undesigned mess than something that an intelligent engineer would produce. And let me give you an example, and let me explain why. I mean, these are the facts. The facts we know are we are conscious beings and we exist. For whatever reason, whatever the causes are, we can at least all agree that we exist and we're conscious beings. And the universe is as science has observed it to be. Most people in here, I think, assume that if science has, sussed a particular fact about the universe, that's the fact of the universe. For example, heliocentrism is for another example. The size of the universe, the age of the universe, and so on. Now, given those two facts, the universe does not appear well designed for life, because 99.999999% of the entire universe, all huge sides of it, is lethal radiation-filled vacuum. It's not hospitable to life at all. In fact, the number of places in this universe where life can live is so small that if you were to put them all into one place, and inside, if your house was a scale size of the universe, and you were to put that one little total, all of the places where life could live, and you put it in your house, you would never find it. It would be submicroscopic. It would be that small. And you wouldn't normally conclude that the house was built for that submicroscopic speck, whereas the rest of the house is completely lethal to everything that lives on that speck. Generally, we're running out of time. Okay. So you can talk about that. There's many other facts like that regarding how the universe doesn't appear very well designed for life, ultimately. And whereas atheism predicts that the only way we could exist is if the origin of life was an accident and we evolved through natural selection. But the only way we can be, or life could have originated by accident, is if it was extremely improbable. And the only way an extremely improbable event could happen by accident is if the universe were really, really huge and really, really old and had tons and tons of stars in it, billions and trillions of solar systems, so that there's so much in it that very improbable things are going to happen naturally. And yet that's what we observe. We observe ourselves in this gigantic universe, billions and trillions of star systems in it, very little life. Therefore, life is very infrequent. By definition, infrequency is improbability. Therefore, the fact that life is improbable is answered by the huge size and age of the universe. Atheism, therefore, predicts, it entails, the only way we could exist is if we existed in a gigantic universe, billions of light years in size, billions of light years in age, trillions of solar systems. Atheism entails that that's the only universe we could find ourselves in, and lo and behold, that's the universe we find ourselves in. Whereas God could make any universe he wanted. He can make a universe that was completely 100% hospitable to life. So once again, that's not the universe we observe. So the test is failed. Atheism is confirmed.
A response from the yay side to Richard's address.
He wants to say.
Yeah, I'd like to make a couple of brief comments. First, reason one is basically that appeal to God of the gaps type arguments have a history of failing. Well, one thing I would want to point out is that just because there is a certain type of argument for theism that's not very good, it certainly doesn't follow that theism is false. Let me add to the list of bad arguments for theism. Here's one. Tacos are tasty, therefore God exists. This is a really miserable argument for God's existence, but it doesn't follow from the fact that that's a miserable argument that God doesn't exist or that there aren't any good arguments. Part of what I've tried to argue is that religious belief can be justified apart from arguments at all. But I think also there are some very good arguments for God's existence that do lend some rational support for theism. The fact that there are some that aren't very good, I don't think proves very much. But that leads me to the second point. His second reason was divine science. Why doesn't God just show up and talk to me? The way a lot of theists would answer this, I think, is that God does talk if you're interested in hearing what he has to say. That's the whole point about what I've been calling the sensus divinitatis.
I got that.
I think that this comes as a surprise to a lot of atheists, but if you ask the average theist, have you had a religious experience? Most will say yes, so long as you're not limiting religious experience to like a mystical experience or something like that. I think that most theists report having had an experience like this, an experience they would describe as hearing the voice of God, or feeling God's calling on their life, or feeling a conviction that what they were doing was wrong, something to that effect. So it seems to me that many theists would respond by saying, God does talk if you're interested in hearing what he has to say. The third reason is really, of course, the problem of evil. There's a huge literature on this. It's a huge discussion. I can't answer it in 15 seconds, except to just report my conclusion. I think it violates a principle called the condition of reasonable epistemic access, what he has stated. And if anyone is interested in that, I would love to tell you more if you give me the opportunity in the Q&A.
And JT, you had a response?
Yes, to say that God talks, we're just not listening, that's just an ad hominem. You're just saying that our cognitive faculties aren't operating on an appropriate level, and it doesn't really settle the question.
Well, also, it's an attack on our honesty. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm sincere. God can come talk to me anytime.
Yeah, I don't know about anybody else. I know you've read the Bible in Greek. I've read the Bible cover to cover on multiple occasions. You know, I've done the work. I've done the science research even as an undergrad music major. So to say that I'm not interested is just completely unfair. But also, when you say, you know, we've had these personal experiences, have you ever seen an optical illusion? Most of you probably have. But on the surface, you would say that this is something completely other than what it is. That's why it's an illusion. We get around the illusion and the failures in our own ability to perceive sometimes by going at it scientifically, by finding instruments that get around the limits of our human perception. So to say that you have these personal experiences goes back to what I said earlier. When lots of people have varying personal experiences, what is more likely, that God is talking directly to you, or that people are just deluded, lying, or wrong?
Great. Yeah, I would just say that it's hard to know what happens in every person's life. I certainly wouldn't discredit anyone's honesty on the other team, but the fact is that most people, when they do ask those questions, most people do come up with an answer where they feel that it is justified. They feel that God does exist. So, I mean, there's always going to be outliers, and most people aren't atheists. There's going to be something, and it could be experiential. Perhaps a very traumatic thing happened. Someone, in the name of religion, did something that was unconscionable and was wrong, and that leads someone to an opinion that then leads them to discredit everything else. So. But I wanted to say one thing, and that is that a little of my own evolving philosophy of religion. I disagree that we live only in the phenomenal world. The noumenal world, the mysterious, is accessible, and I believe that is precisely the realm of the qualia, the ineffable, personal, indescribable experience. And how do we know that that's real? In physics, if we want to sense mass, we use mass. And if we want to sense charge, we use charge. And if we want to sense spirit, or as Dr. Stenger likes to say, you kick mass and it kicks back. You have to kick it with mass, however. If you kick charge, it will kick back. And generally speaking, when people, when I believe people have a spirit, when they apply that spirit to the question, in other words, they kick spirit, it kicks back. So most people have a religious experience where if they devote themselves to really addressing these questions, most people come back with a positive on that. And there's all sorts of ways we could undersample, using a physical analogy, undersample the world, and we all know that in physics that when you undersample, you get aliasing. You get something that might not look at all like what is really there. So that's part of my answer. Do I need to quit?
Vic, do you have a response to that?
Yeah, if God were a moral God, and you would think he would want us to know about him. Okay, so then some people do get this experience. You assume it is God talking to them. Why is he picking them out and not picking the rest of us out? Why are the billions of us who never have that experience why doesn't he talk to us? It's not just a few, it's billions who don't have that experience.
But in terms
That's
of
the only reason I can see is there is a God, a possible God, and that is an evil God. The evil God is perfectly possible, explains a lot of things.
So, would you like to join into that, any of you?
I find it curious that there's a cry of an ad hominem argument from the other side, because we haven't actually said anything about them, as it's if they feel guilty or something. I mean, I can't explain what experiences they have had or haven't had. I mean, maybe this experience is still future for them. Maybe tomorrow God would
There was the suggestion that atheism is a result of psychic wounds or something, abuse from religion.
I would say this. I think that what happens with many atheists...
I'm sorry, one clarification.
I'm not accusing you of deliberately using an ad hominem argument. I don't want to give that impression. Okay. It's just, I think there's, like, you're not thinking through what the implications are of what you're saying. And I think that the implications are, in the same way that someone might say something that's not intentionally sexist, but if they thought it through, they'd realize the implications were, and they might go, oh, okay, you're right, I shouldn't think that. I'm saying the same thing here, that when you're talking about God hasn't talked to me, there must be something wrong with me, or God doesn't like me, or something like that. I'm not saying that you're saying that. I'm saying that that's an implication of what you are saying. And I'm just trying to hope that you will see that implication. I hope that clarifies. I just didn't want to mislead you.
Okay. I was just going to say, I think that what happens for many atheists, though, is that there are these kinds of experiences at some point in their life, but then they are retroactively explained away after they come to believe some kind of atheistic theory, naturalism, or something else. They become convinced that there are these ways of debunking religious beliefs. And so real experiences that were had in the past now become suspect. So I think that I don't want to make any general claims about what kinds of experiences people have or don't have, but just a word of warning about that our experiences are themselves subject to reinterpretation later on. And so, I'm sorry.
Charlie Self, last word for this part of the discussion. We'll open it up to Q&A.
That one thing that's not really been addressed, and our opponents have commented on, in a sense, the evidence or the provability. Victor, in particular, talks about just give some proof. We have not brought up thousands and thousands and thousands of documented experiences that people have of supernatural phenomena. The fact is, and Dr. Carrier brought up this thought of the two horses, which I think is a great analogy. But if you go around the world, and we're not simply speaking of unsophisticated locales, but if you go around the world, the analogy doesn't hold up completely, because scientific knowledge is increasing globally, and for that we are grateful. Healthcare, other things follow. At the same time, religious, theistic experiences, beliefs, supernatural phenomena in the lives of people are not diminishing just because science is growing. I can take you to PhD physicists who are in Africa who are also involved in the spiritual experiences. So I think we want to be careful not to take too narrow a sample.
Thanks. And
Well,
Vic, last comment.
Yeah, there's no doubt that people have spiritual experiences. There's no problem about that. It just doesn't mean that there's God. None of them, there isn't a single example that one could give of a spiritual experience that told us something that would offer proof of God. And it could have been. It could have been. Any one of you could prove God's existence with a spiritual experience right now that tells us something we didn't know, that could be tested scientifically. And believe me, all these have been tested. Or there have been people working on this for years and years. Psychic phenomena have been studied for 150 years. There's no field that I can think of in science who has had more negative results for such a long period of time and not a single positive result that still is an existing field. The field of psychic experiences or spiritual experiences. And yet it's still going on. People are still studying something after 150 years of absolutely zero evidence.
We agreed on some ground rules, but we're breaking them right now. One last comment, and then we'll get into some Q&A.
I mean, kind of talk about the methodological issue. Certainly in my 5 minutes, I didn't go into detail about the specific issue of comparing the horses based on methodologically sound horse races versus rigged horse races. Certainly if you count horse races that haven't gone through a proper methodological procedure to confirm what actually is going on, those races don't count, essentially. And I make that argument in my book that when you actually do start to dig at those things, the evidence unravels. And one example was brought up was near-death experiences. Keith Augustine has written a very marvelous, extensive, multi-part system of articles for one of the Journal of Near-Death Research, or I can't remember the exact title of the journal, but Keith Augustine, Google Keith Augustine and NDE, you'll find them, where he shows that all of the evidence for NDEs is based on methodologically unsound conclusions. The science is wrong. And so you have to throw that data out. It doesn't count. And so I think when you throw all the not counting data out, that's where you get the 2 horse races. So that's just to make sure that you understand what my argument is. Yeah.
With that, gentlemen, we have concluded our official back and forth. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And now I hope that there is a young woman named Lauren with a microphone who can run around like Donahue and take any questions. Question right there in the black shirt.
Hi,
And again, just to remind everyone, these should be questions, not comments, short questions, not essays.
my question is directed to the
Yes, I'll make sure that.
the theist table. For our
Sorry, please continue.
okay, this is directed toward the theist table. For the 5 senses we think of conventionally, sight and touch and all that, we have pretty good physiological knowledge of how those work and anatomical knowledge of where they are. Where on that brain model is the bit responsible for the sensus divinitatis?
It's a very good question.
It's here.
Experience, it's often been called the left temporal lobe. This is, in fact, if when people have epilepsy in the left temporal lobe, they often have divine experiences. The superior parietal lobe on the left side and the right side have to do with our sense, respectively, of our position in space and our individuality as a person, as opposed to being linked sort of to everything else. So it's distributed throughout the brain, and you know, people will like to say on the con side that since it's purely described by the brain, and since we can map out the experiences in the brain, when you're experiencing God, for example, studies have been done where nuns meditate on scriptures, and then they say, okay, I'm feeling God. They rush them into an fMRI machine and measure their brain, and certain parts of their brain are active, others have gone dark. And so some people will say that proves that it's purely something created in the brain. But the counter argument to that is to say, okay, you could stimulate a particular part of my brain, and I would think of an apple pie, and does that mean apple pies don't exist? It's not adequate to simply say, well, the brain does it. And I'd like to bring an analogy from C.S. Lewis, who said, those of us who feel we experience religious experiences and deeper spiritual experience would say that it is a type of experience than can be explained by the brain. However, the brain is sort of like a medium that has fewer symbols to express what is in fact a richer experience, the religious experience. So he calls it transcription, where just because a certain experience in your brain, a certain activity in your brain is related to something else in the normal physical world, doesn't mean that it's not actually being used for other purposes. In physics, we have the symbol alpha, which means the thermal expansivity, or it could mean the fine structure constant. There's just too few symbols for that.
Because we want to get to as many questions as possible, 2 things. The panelists who answer the questions will try to make their responses short, and we're going to try to alternate between the yay side and the nay side. So does anyone have a question for the dirty little atheist table? A question for the atheist, right there in the middle.
Howdy.
I'm just curious, how does your ideological commitment to atheism enrich your life and motivate you to become a better human being?
Well, I don't think it's so much our commitment to atheism as an ideology, but to reason as an ideology. I don't think we can have the discussion of what is moral until we have the discussion of what is true. For instance, if you woke up one day to find that your whole town was impopulated with zombies, if you were a good person, you would grab the shotgun, lock and load Hollywood style, and go rescue your neighbors. And if by the end of the day you've laid waste to every zombie in town, you'd be a hero. But if you were wrong about just one fact, whether or not they were actually zombies, you've gone from being a complete hero to joining the ranks of some of the worst people to have ever lived. This is the effect that what our beliefs have on our actions, because your intentions are pure either way. It's whether or not you have reasoned your way to what is true that determines whether or not your actions are moral. So I would say it helps me to be a more moral person, and helps me to be in line with my human empathy.
Another comment here to answer that, or we'll go to the theist question. A question.
Okay.
A question for the, can I say dirty little theists? No. Question for the believers. Right behind you, Lauren.
Hi. Well, my question is, seems to me that a lot of the most ancient religions were polytheistic. When I hear people talking about God, my big question is, which God are you talking about? So I could take an answer from either side of the table there. Maybe it's possible that there is a flawed concept and people, some of the most primal religions were animistic. I'm thinking of bodhisattvas. I'm thinking of American Indian religions. I'm thinking of the Greek Parthenon. The Pantheon.
So the question is, which God?
Or what's up with all that? Why do we have to focus on this one God thing?
So which God?
Well, we have been, our aim has been to demonstrate the reasonableness of theism, and I'll say the monotheism. We're not disputing the facts of history that people think otherwise at all, and we're not disputing the correlation of some of those thoughts and beliefs with our own or the differences. And our friendly opponents have also made it clear that folks who believe in more than the physical world have a whole bunch of different perspectives of that. We are defending a basic view that Jew, Christian, Muslim, or even an open-minded deist might affirm. We're not pretending to speak for anybody that has any religious sensibility.
Thank you, Charlie. Question for the atheist side. Right down here, the walkway.
This is a question in response to the nay table, in response to the idea that God doesn't get involved, or should God get involved if bad things happen. 3 points. First question is, if God is a moral God...
Yes, please limit to one question.
Okay, if God is a moral God, and if he does get involved, would he have to get involved every single time from that point on? And if he does get involved at all times, how would we distinguish between what is good? Would there be a dichotomy between good and bad, and how would we know what is bad without good, or vice versa?
Richard Carrier.
Yeah, definitely. The question, that's actually relates to a different issue. We're talking first about whether God exists. Now, if God did anything, the question would be settled.
Microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. If God did anything, the question would be settled. So the issue isn't how much should he do. That would be a question of how moral is God, or what limitations does God have, and so forth. But if God did anything, and certainly he would do something. Obviously God has the ability to talk to a child and tell him not to eat a piece of meat, or to talk to the parent and tell them you need to move that further away so the child can't grab it. We know God, by definition, God is supposed to have that power, right? If you're going to say he doesn't have that power, now you're talking about something other than a God, something less powerful than a God. So my issue is first, let's worry about whether God exists, and then once we have the evidence that God exists, he is a moral agent, he's doing moral things, then we could start talking about, well, is he doing enough, or is he justified in not doing more? And I think there are answers to that question. There could be limits to how much interference God should do.
Thank you, Richard. Any other comment on the atheist side on that question? A question for the theist, right here in the front row. We haven't had anyone ask questions from down here.
Yeah, actually, this is kind of my question from previous during the student debate. I like faith. I think faith is great, but my understanding of faith is different. I have faith in myself. I have faith in every single individual in this room, and that we're mostly good people, just faith in general. But I think, isn't it counterproductive to have faith in something that is unproven?
Jump in? Well, I'll jump in. I want to answer your question directly. Is it counterproductive to have faith in something that is unproven? We don't believe that it is unproven. Now, our opponents have given outstanding arguments for the non-existence or reasons why they are skeptical about the reality of God. But we have tried to do the same on the other side. We believe that creation and conscience, that morality, that beauty, that justice, that these different things are evidence. I'll use that word carefully next to the evidentialist here, but we believe...
No evidentialist me.
No, you're not. But we believe that these are pointers to God. Now, the implication of your question is important in that simply belief in God by itself does not automatically guarantee that everybody who professes that is going to be the kind of person that you aim to be and the kind of a moral person you aim to be. But we think it's the proper grounding of that.
Right. Thank you. A question for the atheist side. Anyone in back maybe would go all the way back to the top. Run, Ms. Donahue. Please, yeah, follow. Yeah, I think we can. So, yeah.
All right, I had a question. How is naturalism not married to social Darwinism? Because I would assume that you would argue that it's not, that survival of the fittest is not what you would argue for, but I don't understand how it's not married to naturalism. If we are just a higher evolved animal, then it seems like it would follow that survival of the fittest and social Darwinism would have to be true.
So this is the main beef that many religionists have with Darwinism, the moral implications of it. That's the Discovery Institute wedge document.
Right.
What's your response to that?
I have a response.
I do too.
Vic?
I'll play it for it. Okay.
Well, you know, I think too much is put on evolution as the natural source. I mean, the human body is the same as it was 10,000 years ago. We have not evolved. Evolution works over a very short time scale. And I think, in fact, what we have reached now with humanity is a post-evolutionary period where we're not evolving anymore. And we should stop looking for evolutionary explanations. We should look for explanations based on the fact that we've developed this powerful brain and these other analytical tools, and it's these that have led us to accept our morality, to develop a natural morality. And this gives me a chance to also comment on something I've been chafing at the bit to say, and that is our opponents have constantly given the impression that they think that theist thinking about morality is somehow different from atheist thinking. And I want to insist that we both are doing the same kind of thinking. We're both reasoning to morality. I don't know where they get their morality if it's not by reasoning. They certainly can't get it from the Bible. Both the Old and New Testaments are immoral documents, and there isn't a single teaching in the New Testament it's an original moral teaching. Jesus Christ was not a moral figure. There are many instances where he committed immoral acts. So where are they getting their immorality? What they're doing is they're doing the same thing we're doing. They're looking at the world, and they may pick and choose some good stuff from the Bible, like the Golden Rule, which goes back thousands of years. It wasn't originated there. Okay, it was picked up, it was put in the Bible. Here it's in the Bible. Go ahead and we'll accept that. That's fine, but it's because they have chosen. Why were there so many Christians against slavery? Why were there so many Christians in the abolitionist movement? People like to say, "Oh, look at how Christians led that movement." That was wonderful, because they were ignoring what was in the Bible, and they were deciding for themselves that slavery was immoral. And so I wish they would stop trying to tell us they're thinking any different than we are.
JT, quick response on the question about social Darwinism necessarily flowing from Darwinism.
Social Darwinism, or I say evolution, is a purely naturalistic process. And the thing is, we have evolved empathy. We can feel the suffering of others, and nature really can't. So acknowledging that nature culls the weak doesn't oblige us to follow suit. You know, you hear people say Hitler was a social Darwinist. He saw that natural selection occurs, so he just wanted to expedite the process. But that's like saying, I acknowledge that hurricanes destroy cities, so I'm going to go do that myself. It just doesn't make any sense if we have a brain. that generates thoughts of empathy and sympathy for the feelings of others?
Because I feel like that's a really important point, and I think there was a response here. We'll conclude with the Theist table responding to the same question. Does social Darwinism necessarily flow out of Darwinism? Charlie,
First of all, I want to be really clear, and I think we can find a point of real unity here. Social Darwinism, as practiced in the 19th century, early 20th century, is an aberration of science, evolution. So there's complete agreement there between the two sides.
That's a unique view among many Christian apologists.
I'm not suggesting that people didn't take it and run in directions that are horrific. That's a different issue. The second thing I want to say here is that we're reading two different Bibles. And the fact of the matter is that a careful reading of the Hebrew and Greek scriptures, a careful reading of what we call Old and New Testaments, in our minds produces a progressive and redemptive understanding of humanity, of social ethics, of spiritual experience. So different worldviews and dispositions will find different things in the same text. And we want to be honest about that. And on the other hand, atheists and theists can unite in some of the values they hold together, even when those values are derived from different sources. So going out and making the world a better place, in our mind, it's a down payment of the future. Mm-hmm. In the atheist perspective, it's the best we do because this is what we have. But in the case of Dr. Stenger and myself, we have two different lenses as we look at the same scriptures.
Okay. We have had 2 hours of discussion on a college campus about one of the most important questions I think college students should ask. Unfortunately, it's asked infrequently at colleges and universities today. I want to give each side an opportunity to have a very short closing comment. Nothing's been prepared. This isn't a formal debate, but here we are with a big audience of people interested in this question, so an opportunity for one closing comment. Someone on the atheist side.
Yeah, I love Charlie's last comment. That was really good. I'm glad to hear, especially I wish more Christians would come out and argue against, for example, what was that terrible documentary lambasting atheists for being social Darwinists recently? Expelled, for example. Expelled had a lot of creepy similarities to Nazi Jewish, anti-Jewish propaganda films. There are a lot of similarities of condemning us for every evil in society and blaming it on our ideology and so forth. And I'm very glad to see Christians that are willing to stand up against that kind of bigotry and irrational thinking about us. I wish there would be more Christians vocalizing and saying, denouncing other Christians for using that kind of abusive, incorrect reasoning and so forth. And I think that their kind of attitude prevents what you were talking about, is us working together, essentially, to better the world. Now, I'm fully in favor of that. In fact, I think religious liberty is necessary for the good life. It's necessary politically to have that, and so that people can work together. And America has been really good at fostering this idea of we don't kill each other very often. In fact, I can't think of a case where people go around killing each other for religious reasons. It's extremely rare. Yeah, okay, but just let me be real. Yeah, okay, let me just make the point. Then the one problem that we have is that when we're trying to cooperate with Christians are trying to take liberties away from us. For example, the right of abortion, for example, or the right of homosexual marriage. Things like this where we're trying to better the world and you get in our way, at least the way we perceive is you getting in our way. And you see the same thing as us getting in your way in certain ways. And that, I think, is the problem that I don't know how to solve. If we're not going to agree on worldviews, I don't know how we're going to come to a reconciliation on that socially and politically. And I'm hoping maybe someone can work that out and we can move ahead. So that's my end comment. That's all I have to say.
Look at that selflessness on the Christian side.
I just wanted to say a couple of things. One, and some of these are in summary, it's a bit of a response. There's one claim by the atheists is that is that the universe does not appear to be designed for life because we are such a tiny byproduct. We could take a look at the Saturn V rocket, and someone would say, oh, that wasn't designed to go to the moon. Why? Because, well, if it was designed to go to the moon, then there wouldn't be just a tiny capsule. I mean, all we need is the capsule. But we don't understand what is necessary in creating a universe. I don't think any of us do. It's a profound thing, and we have only a dim knowledge of it. But I wanted to say that this is an excellent book. I highly recommend Dr. Stenger's book, and I agree with it in every respect, except what seems to be non sequiturs, where he'll throw in, so there is no God. If we take those out, it's fantastic, and I'm learning all kinds. I'm learning all kinds of stuff, and he's also helped me out in one very important way, because since nothing is something, I don't have to remember my anniversary anymore. But I wonder if you would sign it for me, because it's a brilliant book, it's awesome, and if you could you like sign it? Yeah. Okay. And if you could just say, could you say all God's blessings or something? All right.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking again all of our panelists for this important discussion. Thank you.